It's story time, kids, and this one is a wild ride. Buckle up. Cryonics is a process where we stick rich people into sealed thermoses and lower the temperature down to around negative 190 degrees Celsius. If you need the conversion for that, it's like negative 370 degrees in freedom units. One thing to highlight right from the start is that cryonics is not what you'd call a standard science. Some of the very first people who underwent this process had to be scraped off the bottom of their capsules. Make sure to watch all the way to the end because we're going to talk about that happening, but we're also going to start with the real science behind freezing human bodies for possible future reanimation in a segment I'd like to call Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous Popsicles. Cryonic freezing is often and commonly erroneously called cryogenic freezing. Cryogenics is actually a totally separate thing. It's a field of real science that studies objects at ridiculously low temperatures. The official designation starts at negative 153 degrees Celsius or 120 degrees Kelvin. Cryonics is something more akin to cryopreservation, which is another real science with a lot of practical medical implications. Cryopreservation deals with freezing single-celled biological material. This involves things like freezing eggs for fertility treatments and family planning. It also includes freezing blood platelets for future transfusions and preserving stem cells for use at a later time, and also producing gene therapies for leukemia or lymphoma. So cryopreservation is a real medical science used each and every day to treat and research and move medicine forward and take care of people. Then we have cryonics, which is not those things. A lot of people in the first two fields would even go as far as to say it's a complete pseudoscience. But the industry itself would say that it's just an extreme form of cryopreservation, because instead of freezing just one cell, you're freezing an entire human body, or sometimes just a head. Either way, the problem is we don't know how to do that. Right now, we can't even successfully freeze anything bigger than a cell or just a small cluster of cells. The biggest problem right now with cryofreeze is all the damage to living tissue from ice crystals and how we need to deal with that to circumvent it. We're talking massive body-wide damage at the cellular level, because these ice crystals are teeny tiny and they form in various parts of the cell because we're all made of water, and when you freeze that water it gets sharp and pointy, and things like our brains really don't like that. So after you put people in their little capsules in these containers or frozen and stored in basically insulated thermoses, and these are called dewars, which, wait a minute, isn't that a whiskey? Is everyone in the field of cryofreeze actually just drunk? Because that would explain a lot. Okay, I have a confession to make. I lied about the fact that ice crystals are the biggest problem with cryonics right now. Because the actual biggest obstacle to getting this to work at all is the fact that you can't be prepped for cryofreeze until you are dead. Dying, death, being dead is very genuinely the biggest problem with this process. Now, proponents of cryofreeze will say that industry prep teams go to work within minutes, and it's all totally fine. Unfortunately, the body really doesn't have minutes before irreversible damage begins to set in. According to the Cleveland Clinic, brain damage can start just after 4 minutes of reduced oxygen flow. And in this case, the brain is not experiencing reduced oxygen, it's experiencing no oxygen because it is dead. So this is how cryonics works. You sign on with a company that's going to freeze your remains. The doctor in charge of your care tells them when they think you're about ready to plunge into the abyss. At that point, the company sends their team from whatever nearby depot they spawn from, I don't know, Haagen-Dazs probably, and then they stay close to the hospital until you code. At that point, the team packs up your body like a cooler of beer on a fishing trip, and bags of dry ice are used to keep the patient from breaking down before they even get in the freezer. This whole initial step of packaging and transportation is possibly already too time consuming, and it may be already too late to reanimate someone in the future at this point anyway. Now, if by some miracle that wasn't enough to derail the whole thing right from the start, there are still many more problems to deal with. Clive Cohen, professor of neuroscience at King's College London, told the BBC this year that cryonics is, quote, a misplaced faith in antifreeze. And I really like that. He goes on to say that it's also a misunderstanding of death in physics, and the process of decomposition would just start right back up again anyway as soon as somebody's body is thawed out. Though cryopreservation scientists did figure out how to avoid the formation of ice crystals in the freezing process of biological matter, therefore preserving the tissue for possible reanimation later. Technically, in both cryopreservation and cryonics, tissues in people aren't even frozen, they're something that's called vitrified. They undergo a process of vitrification. This is where the liquid in your body is replaced with cryopreservatives like dimethyl sulfoxide and ethylene glycol, which is a component that, yes, like Professor Cohen mentioned, is in the antifreeze that you put in your car. This turns the liquid into your body into sort of a glass-like substance, and then the temperature in your dewar is lowered in phases. And this prevents ice crystals from absolutely devastating the tissues of the human body. The process nowadays is totally ice-free, so no hope anymore of drinking your dewars on the rocks. But the biggest problem is still the death thing, and this will never work until we figure that out. Or will it? Anna Bagenholm is a Norwegian woman who survived a skiing accident in 1999, and she's a super famous medical marvel of a case that's often pointed to by cryonics and longevity proponents. Because Anna broke into the ice on her skiing trip and fell into freezing water where she was held for 80 minutes. 40 minutes into it, she had a heart attack and died. 3 hours after she fell through the ice and about 2.5 hours after her heart stopped completely, she was resuscitated and went on to make a full recovery. In 2009, she came out to say that she was having minor symptoms in her hands and feet related to some possible nerve injury, but that seems to be the extent of any long-term effects, which, is mind-boggling. But what the cryonics people miss about this incredible medical story is that Anna was also getting CPR the entire time, starting from when rescuers were finally able to get her out of the ice to the time she was hooked up to a ventilator in the hospital. CPR was circulating oxygen to her brain, and since her metabolism had slowed down to almost nothing from the low temperatures, she didn't really need much of it to maintain survivability. The pod people, however, in your grocer's freezer, they aren't sealed up with the second person in their little tubes who are doing chest compressions and mouth-to-mouth for potentially hundreds of years until they're revived. And, not to mention the reasons that Anna miraculously survived are really just an educated guess. We don't actually know 100% what happened, and there's really no way to repeat that kind of experiment over and over again with any reliability until we do know. Alright, so we have Anna, who was naturally frozen and then reanimated. Let's talk about the people who are unnaturally suspended into their new frozen fish stick form and what their fates have been. The first person ever cryonically frozen is an anonymous woman from Los Angeles. We still don't know her identity even to this day. She was frozen in 1966 by the now defunct Cryocare Equipment Corporation. She was plopped into liquid nitrogen without the use of any cryopreservatives at all, and then stuck in cold storage at temperatures just above freezing. And then just 1 year into the whole process, her family ended up taking her out of cryofreeze and burying her. The second person cryonically frozen was James Bedford, a psychology professor at the University of California. He died from metastatic kidney cancer in 1967 and paid $100,000 to be frozen by the now defunct Life Extension Society. He's now stored at Alcor, which is confusingly formally named the Alcor Life Extension Foundation. There's only so much you can do with the words, with the life and the extension and the yeah. Bedford is the only person frozen before 1974 that's still frozen now. Yeah. Alcor is one of the bigger and most well-known cryonics companies, and they've managed to stick around where lots of other companies have come and thawed out. In the early days, the model for generating revenue didn't really make a lot of sense because the people who the companies would be charging to freeze them were also the people who were frozen. So generating a stabilizing income was a little challenging because the frozen Popsicle people weren't like going to the ATM. And that was okay, I guess, because early cryonics operations were just really like the Wild West anyway. If you had paid good money back in the 60s and 70s to go through this, you'd probably be really pissed because there was no guarantee that you wouldn't be accidentally thawed out at any random time, possibly even thrown away like trash or just forgotten altogether, or the subject of multiple failures that made sure you could never be reanimated in even the best of cases, even if you were technically still frozen now. I mean, back then it was basically just one guy doing this as a hobby. Like, we're talking Mr. Freeze and the Crypt Keeper rolled into one. Patients in those days really did not have a lot of hope of ever being reanimated. We're talking about people who were frozen as an afterthought or not even remotely in any sense of urgency with any logic involved. In one case, a man was kept in a mortuary freezer for a year before they could get him in a capsule. In another case, a woman went through an autopsy before being frozen, which is like, what? But not only that, she was also hauled around in her son's truck bed for a while that he'd just fill up with dry ice. What a gem of a devoted son. In another case, a teenage daughter whose father died suddenly dug the man up out of his grave with a backhoe to stick him in a capsule. One young boy who was frozen too fast seems to have physically shattered. Oh, this one's fun. A man in Nederland, Colorado named Brito Moorstall was cryonically frozen by his grandson, but then taken out of the facility and stored in a shed in the backyard under dry ice. After it was found out that you can't actually store dead people in your shed in town, a brief legal kerfuffle followed that resulted in mass media coverage of the situation, which then led to the creation of an annual festival there called Frozen Dead Guy Days. In 2023, Brito was moved to the Stanley Hotel's Ice House in Estes Park, which is now the site of the world's only museum of cryonics. The stories just go on and on and on, but the most incredible, perhaps haphazard buffoonery I've seen from all of this comes from a guy named Robert Nelson. Nelson would go on to be responsible for the Chatsworth Cemetery incident, which is apparently the biggest horror story in cryonics even today. Nelson led one of the three main original groups. There was the Cryocare Equipment Corporation in Phoenix, Arizona, the Cryonics Society of California in Los Angeles, and the Cryonics Society of New York, which was the organization that actually first coined the term cryonics. But it was the Cryonics Society of California, the CSC, that was helmed by Robert Nelson. Nelson started out by initially freezing James Bedford shortly before handing him back over to the family. And normally, back then, this would be a death sentence because it would guarantee a major failure point and possible thawing event. But Bedford's son was actually unusually diligent, and this is why he's the only person still frozen from those early days. Nelson began his operation by keeping bodies on dry ice at a mortuary. It wasn't too long before the situation became untenable and he was just kicked right out of there. Cryocare, which had stepped out of the game because their president realized there was no money in cryonics, they made their own capsules and they were storing one at CSC because their rates were the lowest. So what Nelson did was that he cut that capsule open and stuffed his own frozen Popsicle people in with the guy whose capsule it was, and after somehow managing to fit all these people inside like puzzle pieces, welded it back up. Of course, this whole thing took hours and possibly an entire night, and there's no way the body stayed frozen that whole time. Nelson then bought a cemetery vault that opened from above, and he stuffed the capsule down in there. These capsules had to be refilled periodically with liquid nitrogen because the liquid nitrogen would boil off from time to time. Nelson said in a court document that he'd been maintaining the capsule out of the kindness of his heart, basically because the families of the four bodies inside had stopped paying him. About 2 years after he'd bought the vault, it looks like he just stopped showing up to refill the liquid nitrogen in that one, and the bodies inside thawed out. He also eventually had a second capsule in there, and this one leaked too quickly because the vacuum tubing had failed. And in that capsule, of course, he'd combined multiple patients transferred from other capsules and other facilities, and this one included an 8-year-old boy who died of leukemia. Now, it was at this point that the press started to get wind of things, and supposedly they went to the cemetery and forced the vault open. This was 1979, and the only thing that we know for sure that they found was a stench that, quote, strips away all defenses, spins the stomach into 1,000 dizzying somersaults. CSC would soon fold after the lawsuit arrived. The court ruled that Nelson was liable for a $1 million fine, but he ended up paying nothing at all except $18,000 in attorney's fees, while his partner paid out $400,000 from his insurance. Maybe the worst part of all of this is that Nelson had helped a handful of people set up their own in-home or in-cemetery cryonics operations, and those people would then have to go on to maintain their own frozen family members, negotiate and accept deliveries of liquid nitrogen, and all the rest involved just all on their own. Obviously not the most ideal of operations just done by regular people. In one of these cases, Nelson helped a man named Nicholas de Blasio store his wife Anne, who they set up in a cemetery in New Jersey in 1971. Of course, she was also not alone, because as so often seemed to be the case in the early days, she had someone else frozen by CSC in there with her. This particular doer was designed so that you could refill the liquid nitrogen without having to open it up all the way. But that also meant that the tube structure let more liquid nitrogen boil off than other capsules did, and the lid also frosted over because of this. They would have to repeatedly break the ice off the lid with a hammer, which ultimately led to a failure of the capsule. And after multiple attempts to restore it, at one point they just had to take the bodies out to fix it when they'd become stuck to the capsule like a child's tongue on a metal post in the winter. Of course, this resulted in the bodies thawing out completely, and even so, they decided to keep trying, and they froze them all over again. And then, when they finally gave up because they just couldn't maintain the repeated failures of this capsule, that's when they had to scrape what one industry professional called a, quote, plug of fluids off the bottom of the dewar that had once been people. They did this with help from a local mortuary and then gave back the capsule so it could be repurposed for someone else. You're lucky them, yeah. It's not like a used car. These days, there are less and less horror stories, probably because there's money in the field now. Technology has also improved drastically and the number of participants has climbed. There are two main players in the space today, Alcor, we've talked about, and the Cryonics Institute. There are also companies in Russia and China. There's at least one startup in Germany called tomorrow.bio. There are not a lot of exact figures out there from trustworthy sources, but it's possible that there are about 500 to 600 frozen people right now, along with a couple dozen pets, including one chinchilla named Button. Companies can charge differing rates, but it seems to cost on average about $200,000 to be frozen, and that's not counting monthly membership fees and annual membership dues. Humanity is just highly obsessed with making things from science fiction exist in reality. Cryofreeze is probably one of the most highly pursued and widely anticipated of those concepts. Maybe only second to teleportation, and that little box on Star Trek that you could just make whatever you wanted to eat or drink. I want that thing. Ooh, and a lightsaber. While it may be possible to bring someone back from cryofreeze in 500 years, 1,000 years, more, we certainly can't do it right now. And there's also the whole problem of having your descendants agree to keep paying for you to be frozen for that long. In 1983, Alcor had 3 patients transition from a full body freeze to what's called neuropreservation. This is where just the head is frozen. And this is done to save on costs, and it's also just easier to sustain overall, because families will only pay for the head. They had to decapitate the patients with a chainsaw since they were rock solid. But after that, this was a really great opportunity for Alcor to try to figure out how difficult it would be to reanimate someone using the bodies of these people whose heads were still frozen. And what they found was that when the bodies began to thaw, multiple insurmountable mechanical errors showed up in the physiology. So while everything seemed to kind of look fine from the outside while they were still in the meat freezer, upon thawing, they found multiple gigantic cracks that ran deep into the tissue, fractures in almost every single organ, including the heart and the intestines. One spinal cord was broken in 3 separate pieces. Alcor actually documented all this, and you can read about it in a link in the description. What they also said at the time was that there was no way to see what was happening at the molecular level, but the prediction, of course, was that these bodies were equally destroyed there too. The company's take seems to be that the problems with the freezing technology aren't necessarily a current obstacle at all, but issues that future technology will work out, and will have repair mechanisms that can make people whole again at some hypothetical distant time. As the CEO of tomorrow.bio says, "I can't say how high the probability is, but I'm pretty confident in saying the probability is higher than cremation, if nothing else." Someday we might really figure out whether or not we can bring back our friends, family, and Button after stuffing them inside a giant thermos full of liquid nitrogen. Until then, I'll see you guys at the bar crawl during Frozen Dead Guy Days in Colorado this spring. Stay frosty. Well, no, but maybe. Well, no, but maybe.